Okay, cool. That worked. All right, g'day everyone. Thanks for coming along to my talk. I see lots of people with ice cream, so I know where I'm headed after this talk because I've been holding off, but now just enticed by what everyone else has. Um, I'm going to run through essentially what I've called this talk, superhero layouts, is going through the ages of comic books, where they're quite simplistic to where they get quite complicated, and see how we can turn each of those layouts into, or each of those comic book pages into web layouts with some of the kind of modern CSS tooling that we have available now. And so, as I was saying, we're going to go through the ages, and comics are said to have passed through sort of four distinct ages, and each of those ages is known to have something kind of special about it, all right? We were sort of first introduced to the superhero in the golden age of comics. This is said to have kicked off about 1938. It was the introduction of characters like Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman. We step forward now to the Silver Age, and the world is recovering from a world war at this point, and so people have been through a lot, right? And so a lot of the readers had matured during that time, so writers needed to meet that maturity. So the stories started to focus instead on horror, crime, and romance, and this effectively helped the industries to survive through that stage. Now, after the Silver Age had used many of the heroic storylines, the Bronze Age instead tackled social issues. So they were looking at things like bigotry, racism, substance abuse. That's what became the focus of all of the stories now. And then we go into the modern age, and this is a bit of a time of redesign, growth, and also disruption from the web, from probably all of us. Anyone could now publish comics, right? But that was good because it brought with it some really unique stories. And it made it more accessible to audience than anyone thought possible before that. It wasn't about like one or two kind of significant players anymore. Now, what makes this kind of relevant to web is what makes the comics an absorbing storytelling medium is that along with these great characters, stories, and art styles, is the impact that the layout can have when telling the story. And we're going to explore each age as it relates to web layout and how CSS Grid combined with other CSS techniques can be used to recreate some of these layouts. So all of the examples I'm going to show here, they're comics, right? But don't, when you're looking at them, sort of consider how you can align this or apply this to the work that you're doing now. I'm just using comics because I like them and it's a fun storytelling thing. But you've got to look at it and think about, okay, I see what this is doing and how I can apply it to the layouts that I'm creating. And I also don't go too much into responsiveness with grids. I feel like that's been pretty well covered. This is more about how we can do some unique layouts with that. So combined, these comic ages spanned about 70 odd years, which is a decent amount of time to evolve a storytelling medium. In comparison, our industry, the web, is still relatively young. So we've got HTML at about 30 odd years and CSS at 26 years. And so that makes me older than CSS and HTML, not combined, thankfully, but the web is young, right? So this is kind of what we've been dealing with. And the point that I'm getting to there is that in a relatively short period of time, layout on the web has progressed through many of its own ages. So we started off with HTML, right? Things were simple, text, links, buttons, that's all the web was. Then we took tables and we started using them not for tables, but for layouts to try and make it a little bit more interesting and dynamic. The first of our comic crossovers, we had Flash come along. What that brought with it in dynamic content, we sort of suffered in it being a proprietary system that didn't work on mobile phones. We've gone through sort of absolute float, responsive design is kind of where we're in, kind of on the way into intrinsic design with a lot of the new things like container queries and viewport units, max content and things like that. It's less about setting restrictive breakpoints and more about flowing with the devices that we have. So all of that in 30 odd years, less than half of that of our friends in the comic industry, right? So it can be tempting a lot of the time to give layout on the web a bit of a hard time, right? You would have no doubt heard centering on the web as one of those common jokes that we have. But it's amazing how far we've progressed, right? And we can appreciate what we have now when we consider where we've come from. So is the current age going to be considered the web's modern age? And I think with CSS Grid, that might well be the case. So before we go into the first age, I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name is Anton. I'm here from Perth in Western Australia. So very short flight up to here, like flew by. I originally started in kind of graphic design, but transitioned into development and I have been focused mostly on front end for the majority of my career. Now, as you know, I'm older than HTML and CSS, but not combined. And that sort of gives you an idea of how long I've been working in this area. I am one of the team leads at Doist. So we make Todoist and Twist, sort of mobile applications or other applications. You can find me on Twitter, because I don't want to call it X, at AntonJB. And this might be sort of pointless information, but I quite enjoy comics as well. So let's dive into it. Undoubtedly, sort of one of the most important comics in history is Action Comics #1. This was released during the golden age that we mentioned before. Now, what makes it sort of important in all of the comics that have come out is it's the first appearance of Superman. Which is him holding the car there. Spider-Man nowhere in sight just yet. Now, Superman has gone through a lot of different iterations in their time, but this is where they've started. Now, the layout through the comics and others in the golden, and we're going to include the silver age here a little bit, consisted primarily of these squares and rectangles dotted around the page. And if we look at those, we can see that in use, right? But we're going to focus less on like the pictures inside and more on the layout. So we're going to strip those images out. And the pattern was 1 to 3 panels sort of per row, roughly staggered throughout there with a mostly consistent gap, right? We're printing in the 1930s, so it's mostly consistent. And it's a nice starting point for CSS Grid. And if you've used Grid before, you might think, oh, okay, I would approach that by sort of having the row defined, maybe grid template row, repeating 3 times with 1 fraction each. And that's a fair assumption, right? But we want to have these staggering elements between there. So we need to go just a little bit further when we're working on it. So the way that I was calculating the columns is to measure the smallest possible one. It's not to say that we're going to use a panel that wide or that small. It just gives us an idea of what the smallest possible one is. Now, that's going to give us 36, right? So when we divide that by the entire page width, so 576 divided by 36 gives us 16 possible columns that we want in this layout. And that's basically what we're doing here, is figuring out what's the same ratio as the printed version. So let's put that into code terms. We have our comic there on the thing. We're display grid template columns. We're repeating it 16 times with 1 fraction each. Equal columns along there, and we can be very consistent with our grid gap here because it's the web. What we haven't needed to do is use the grid template rows in this example, because we can rely on what's called the implicit grid to do that for us. So the implicit grid, if content is added that falls outside the defined grid, so our defined grid is what we've done at the front, at the top, pardon me, everything after that is considered outside of that defined grid, and grid will just figure it out for us. It's one of those magic little things that it does. And by default, this implicit grid is automatically sized. So anything that goes in there, it will do that. We do have the option of setting it, so we can say grid auto rows and we can set the values. But we're happy just to have that automatic because we're going to put our images in there. So each panel, we can now start to add those in. We've got our comic defined, so we can start adding our panels in. So we have our panel 1, grid column, span 6 across. So we can just say, just span 6, whatever space you have, take it. And then the next one, grid smart enough to go, okay, this one's spanning 5. I know this panel 1's here. Panel 2 just spans across. And there we go. So we've started a comic layout with only a few lines of CSS code. And the staggering makes a nice touch for it not being too kind of symmetrical or uniform all the time, right? It's something that the web is kind of known for. But we're probably not feeling like superheroes just yet, right? This was just the basis for it. The layout in Action Comic number 1 really never formed part of the story itself. It was just there to lay things out. If we step forward now to the Bronze Age, it brings with it a change in how layout could become a part of the actual storytelling as well. So this is Spider-Man number 121, released in 1973. And this is sort of considered a pivotal point in this character's development. And I hope this isn't a spoiler for something that was released in 1973, but it is the death of Gwen Stacy. Now, of course, in comics now, everyone can die and come back again, and it's all very magical, but at the time, this was going to be permanent, so it was big. Now, what's great about this story, along with the moment, artwork, and the characters involved, is the way that the layout becomes integral to the storytelling itself. The height of the bridge and the fall is shown through this panel that's spanning multiple things, and we wouldn't have gotten that if we had the layout similar to what we had in Action Comics number 1. Now again, it's a great moment in this story thing, but what we're interested in, again, is the layout. So we're going to strip the images out, and here's what we're left with. The big difference from what we just looked at before is that we're spanning multiple rows now, okay? So this is one of those areas where Grid has really given us a sense of a modern layout. We're not constrained to a single axis anymore like we have with pretty much everything that's come before it. Flex, tables even, really, any of those things. Now, we determine the columns the same way as what we did in our previous example. So if we look at the code with display grid, we've got 23 this time, and 1 fraction, and there's our friend gap. We're still able to rely on the implicit grid here. Even though we're going across multiple rows, Grid will figure it out for us. And this is one of those really handy things with Grid. It comes with a lot of help built in. And now if we put our panels in, so panel 1, we're spanning 9 across in the columns, but now we're spanning 3 down in the rows. All right, and the Grid knows, okay, that's how much that's taking up. Panel 2, we just have to say span 7. Yep, I know where that goes. Panel 3 will be there. Panel 4 also spans. So we're saying span 8 and then span 2 down. And it just makes it work. So now that we're kind of working across multiple axes, we're able to cover a great many layouts right up to the Bronze Age of comics. Next up in our journey, Watchmen. It's famous for many reasons, but one is that it's considered to have kicked off the modern age of comics. It actually adhered to a pretty strict 9-panel layout in its run, so 3 by 3, which means that what we've done would actually cover the whole thing, right? And I'm not saying do everything in 9 panels. That's our new grid format that we're going to do. The beauty of Grid is that we can be very dynamic and have grids inside grids and do things. But there was a panel in Watchmen that I wanted to recreate, and it's a panel that does something just a little bit different, a bit outside of the box. The artwork in the second row, so we still have the gaps in it, but it's the same image transitioning between all 3. And again, like that, your first thought, which again would be correct, is, oh, just split the images up and we'll put them in there. But I think there's disadvantages to doing that. We would have to remember every time if we need to update it, right? We're always changing things on the web. So maintaining it, it would be easier if we could just have one image, get the gaps in there, and then if we want to swap it out or deal with responsiveness later, we'll briefly touch on it here, then that's something that would be really great to do. So we have a little bit of setup here in our grid, but our goal, if we think about it, is have the image remain intact while adding that gap in. So the technique works. We have our panel 3 there, which has the solar system inside it, and that's got a container around it. That container has grid on it. We span it 2, so it's filling up the whole area, and the panel 3 with the solar system is going grid row 1, and then 1 through to 2, so it's filling up the whole area. Now, when we're doing things with grid, only the direct children become grid items. But with subgrid, we can inherit the rows or the columns from parent containers. So this is what happens here when we set the grid template columns to subgrid. And we'll look at it again without the images to get a bit of a better understanding of what's happening. So overlap inherits the columns from the columns from comic, applying it to itself. So if the columns in comic change size, so the ones going down that way, if that was to change size or add more, we would automatically get them inside of it. But we don't have to inherit the whole grid here. We've inherited the columns, but we can define our own rows still. And why that might be useful in our kind of comic example that we're going with is if we wanted to say add speech bubbles or something else in there. Now, putting the graphics back in, what we want to do is achieve that gap. So we can use a pseudo element here. We've got the after, and we make that with some CSS custom properties. We're saying outline, variable, grid gap, solid. You might do the color as a custom property as well. And we position it into the grid. So we're kind of faking that grid row and just placing it over the top. Now setting that to the same color and size, so now we have simulated the gap in the grid. And this has got our goal of maintaining the image while simulating the grid gap. And if we wanted to, say for mobile screens, what we've done here, if we want to drop that, we can easily do that without having to adjust the grid any more than what we have. Now, we'll keep going on subgrid because it's one of those really useful ones, and it's a great next step for grid. Anytime you've struggled to align items without setting a height across multiple kind of panels, this is kind of one of those common examples where we have 3 cards, say on a pricing page or something like that. And you'll have one with loads of text in it and one without any text. And you're always trying to set heights or hope that they'll line up because the design has all the lines like matching and the buttons are all lining up and you're like, oh no. So this is an example from the Todoist website, right? Where we've hit this thing. I changed the language to German. German's always great to see where your layout breaks because they have these very long words from an English speaker. I really love German as like an example. If we set height, like in the first one, what we have the problem of is potentially cutting off text, right? Or something happening there. But in the second example, if we use min height, now our lines aren't lining up, right? So that you're kind of picking, well, what's the least bad option that I can do here? Grid and subgrid are going to have us covered. So if we have our grid going there and we define our rows, we can inherit that with subgrid into the others so they all become aware of it. So as the content in the white or the middle area grows, all 3 of them will grow. The advantage of that over doing it flat is we can have semantics with each of our cards while they all stay in sync with each other. So browser support. It's probably on the top of your mind. Yeah. Uh-oh. Firefox had it way back in 2019. They added subgrid. They were really ahead of it there. Safari was a little more recent in version 16. And a lot of the time I would say, let's hope that we see something from Chrome. But quite recently, Chrome have it behind a flag in 1.16. Which means that in 1.17 it should actually release, which is the next version. So we are actually at the point now where subgrid is possible to be used in production, right, without having any of the fallback. So depending on what you're supporting, and of course Edge won't be far behind now that Chrome has it. So it is really close to being done. Before it's more widely available, there are some workarounds that you can do. In this instance, we're doing overlap. We're saying display contents, which essentially takes that container out of the DOM. And then we have to position things a little bit more precisely. And why I wouldn't do this is because we lose all the semantic meaning and it becomes a bit more complicated to do that. But I'm sort of highlighting it as there are options, but subgrid is like this close now. Okay, so it's the next evolution during the modern age now where layout gets a little bit more creative and a little bit more interesting. We're going to go back to Spider-Man just because it's one of my favorites, but we started to see a new trend in this age of comics. The modern age brought sort of more layering panels to achieve a flow and a depth that we hadn't seen before, right? Everything was in its own box, in its own area. And artists were able to focus in and provide little bits of detail or bits of extra story without having to take up too much space. Now, layering certainly isn't new to the web, right? We've been able to do that for a while, but Grid enables us to layer in ways that are a bit easier and a bit more predictable than those previous options before. So we'll again look at the code. So up till this point, we haven't seen grid template rows, right? We've always been relying on the implicit grid, but when we want to start overlapping things, we need to be explicit in our grid. So we're going to define both. And you might be looking at those numbers and saying, he just said it was easy. I think he's lying. But I'll tell you how we kind of ran through that, and I'll show you why I think it is a much more predictable approach to this. So we have the artwork, which is handy. If we're going to figure out the rows, what we want to do, and you'll be seeing similar patterns to how we do this, and this is why I think it's easier. We're going to draw a line for each of the rows that we need. That's the start and the end of the image. And we know we need 9 rows, so we're going to figure out, okay, well, what's our basis for one fraction? So 985 is the total height. By the 9 rows that we're going to need, we get 109. That's our base unit. So next we divide the height of an individual one, so 291 by 109, and we get 2.6 fraction units. So fraction units is something that new or came along with grid. And you might be thinking, well, why not just use percentages? And if we use percent for this and we use grid gap, so if we used 20% and another thing of values to get up to 100 and then add a grid gap, we're going to go over 100%. It's going to stretch more than what we would do. Fraction units work really nicely in grid to not blow past the gap. They all kind of work in together. And we can repeat this same process for the columns. And that's how we got to those numbers. And so now what we can do is layer it where needed using the grid row and the grid column values. So panel 3, which has the lady with the flowers, we're saying grid row 4 through to 7, grid column 5, and we span 1, and we give a z-index just so we make sure we're on the top of the others. Panel 4, which is the field, we have grid row 5 through to 9, and then grid column 2 to -2. And that might seem like a weird addition, right? Like, what are we doing with -2 here? And it's another handy way of positioning grid cells. So grids are aligned from numbers 1 through to n being the number of lines that we have, in this case, 8. But so that's why our starting one is 4 there, or sorry, 2 there for that. But they're also numbered in reverse, so -1 through to -8. And so if we know that we're going to be 2 in from there, we can just say come in 2 from the side. And why that's useful is at the moment we have 8, but if we put any more lines, say between 3 and 5, we add another 2 in there and we used 8 before, then we have to update every use case of 8. If we've come in from the side by 2, as long as we haven't put any after that, our layout is just going to keep working no matter how many sort of changes we do. So it's nice to just be able to do that. And most browser dev tools, I don't remember which one this is, but it's one of them, will show you all of these numbers and lines in there. So you go into the dev tools, turn on show line numbers, and that's a really great way of understanding it. So the modern ages have made prolific use of this layering. It can be a great way of finally breaking out of the boxes that have contained us in design and layout for so many years. And another quick one I did is Hawkeye #1 and the web recreation next to it. Add some sort of thick borders onto it, and you have, again, a really interesting layout that's just done with grid and layering things on top of each other. Who knows Uncle Ben? With great power comes great responsibility. Layering is an exciting addition to our layout toolboxes, but we do have to consider more than just the layout that it opens up to us, right? There's this danger when you can position elements anywhere on the page. If the source order isn't correct, then we can negatively impact the accessibility of a project. So again, as I was saying before, everything always changes on websites. So if we had this field here and we wanted to move it to the top, if we kind of do that and just, we can say, okay, grid panel 4, grid row 1, span 5, grid column 1, move it, we just move it there. Solely changing the visual layout does not tell the browser that the source order has changed. So your HTML is still going to be the same. And so if I was using some sort of assistive technology, I would be getting the version that's on the right, and then other people who are getting the visual version would be getting the version on the left. And so that can be a problem, right? Because they're getting a different version of the content that you're intending. So how can you avoid falling into that trap? Always start with the structure of your document. Lay it out in the way that it would make sense to be read. Then create the grid that supports that layout or creates that layout. And then like any superhero, we have to be vigilant, right? When we're maintaining it, we need to make sure that any changes that we do don't alter that just purely visually, right? We need to make sure that we keep the other one updated as well. A good place to start is this article on NDM Web Docs if you are interested in reading a little bit more about CSS Grid accessibility. Now, common criticism of the web is that everything is so boxy, right? If there was a time when Bootstrap, might be aging myself again, layouts were kind of done that. Tailwind is kind of similar in that things start to look the same. And these have been techniques that have allowed us to work efficiently, right? We're quick, but at the cost of creativity, right? They're all the same. So, and if we look at the pages on the screen that we've done so far, they're all boxes as well. They're all about the same. For comics, boxy layouts started to change during the modern age of comics as well. The characters broke out of the boxes now, and the layouts and the storytelling once again evolved with them. Now, this is a nice example from Phoenix and Jean Grey showing how different shapes can enhance the storytelling, and the important part is the web recreated version next to it, right? Spoiler, it's already done. Now, we aren't able to create grid areas that aren't box shaped, right? They're always going to be boxes, but we can get a little bit creative with what we show and give the illusion of any shape that we like. There's a little bit of setup for this, so we'll step through it. Position relative, because we're going to be moving things around inside. We have our background image and we move that around. And overflow hidden, because we're going to be moving stuff, we don't want it all to explode out the side. The panels each have a grid column to them. Each have sit in a grid area, sorry. And they will do that and we place them in there. Now, you're right to wonder, well, why am I only seeing 2 images here? Because we're going to be cutting them and doing that, we all need them to slightly overlap with each other to do that. We can't just have the grid gap like we had before, because otherwise they're all separate. So we're doing a little bit of funky overlapping here. I don't know if this helps, but visually, this is what it looks like if you were to turn the page like that. They're all just sort of stacked on top of each other. Now, our panels are then kind of rotated and put into roughly where we need them. We've got our panels in grid, we've got the columns, we absolute position it down into the bottom, and we transform it with some rotate and translate Y. It's roughly where we need it. Now, clip path is what is going to make it so that we can get the shapes that we've been wanting. When you add a clip path rule, you can select the polygon, and then each pair creates a node on that path. So we have 0 to 18, 20 to 20, and around we go to getting that. So we now apply that to each one of our panels, and now we start to see where we're getting with that shape. Now, again, you might be looking at those values and going, where does he get them from? Like, they're just seemingly made up. The dev tools are really great for this, right? What you can do is apply just any polygon onto there, and then you can start to modify it. You hit that button, this is Firefox, you can drag the node around, and then you can double click on an area to add another node, and then you drag it sort of into place where you want it. And then I would take that CSS that it generates and, copy paste into the thing, because that's how creative you are. So each of those can be done, that's what I did them in there like that. Now, achieving the white border, so the div that holds it is behind and it's got a white background. So we apply the same shape cutout to the image and we shrink it down a little bit. So we're saying clip path, we've got the polygon and then the image has the same and we scale it down, and we also need to move the origin because things aren't square anymore. We're dealing with some funky shapes here. So we've got to move it a little bit into the center like that. And that's kind of the downside with this technique, right? Like we get that good visual thing there, but we're having to manage a lot of it quite manually. And that, that might be fine for what you're doing. It depends how much it changes. But in terms of a unique layout, that's something that you wouldn't normally see when you're dealing with web and some of these boxy layouts that we've had in the past. And if you haven't seen it yet, each of the examples are live sort of on CodePen. The links are underneath. Don't panic if you haven't snapped any of them. I have a link at the end which will go off to all of them in one go. So clip path is no doubt a powerful tool when combined with grid. And we can see another example here. Batman jumping into the scene. Detective Comics number 876. So we take the grid, the layering, and all of those examples we have from before, and we create the same layout. Now the drawing's a little more intense here, but it's the layout in the background that we're interested in, because what's unique about it is we've got that transparency, but things are overlapping. We're not seeing the boxes behind them, but they're all there. So let's get rid of Batman. We're not interested in him. And we're going to lay out each of those panels there. And here we can see the problem. We're seeing the blue squares come through in the behind part of it. And we can solve that with clip path, because clip path is going along deciding on what you do want to show, not what you don't want to show. So we can do the transform, we give a little bit of perspective, that's what gives us that skew to it. And then we have our polygon on top of it, and we do that same values. Again, I use the dev tools, that's why they look a bit funky, but we cut out the shape. And so it gives us this image of almost a solid border going all the way down with the transparency in the back. So again, cool technique with our layout beside it. And if you want to add Batman, right, because a lot of people like him, you can do the layering that we had before. Put a grid over the top and add him on. Clip path isn't, this one's wild. Clip path isn't just limited to polygons though, okay? So we don't have to do that. I particularly like this cat here. It looks a bit like Two-Face in cat form. So we have the Flash comic, and then I just had to find pictures that would work. But there's options, right? We can layer here, and that's what makes it look complex, is the layering that we've got going on. But if we break it down, there's the grid, and then the 3 clip path type being used. So we've already covered polygon. One of the other ones is ellipse, so we can do there, the first 2 values are the radius of the shape, and then the second 2 values are the position, so we can offset it a little bit. And for more uniform shapes, we have circles. Same thing again. The first value is the radius, followed by the position. We can have a happy little cat in a circle. So where clip path affected the shape of the container, we can also use the shape of the container to affect other things. So here is Saga. The top panel there is the one that we're interested in. We have the planet, and we have the text kind of going along the side of the planet, like wrapping it. It provides a little more interest than the squarish bubbles that we have. And it's something that's been quite common in print, right? You would have likely seen this in a magazine at wrapping along something. But it's been absent from the web for a long time. So setting the shape outside, again, we've got a little bit of setup. Panel 1, that's the wrapper, position relative, because we're going to be floating some things, or float in this case. And we have the paragraph, which we're moving into place, giving it some width. And then we have our image, float, width, height. But the important part is shape outside with the circle. So we give it that shape on the outside, and we avoid that dreaded box shape where our text is wrapping. Now again, browser tools to the rescue. We can define just a simple shape. We can click on that thing, and in real time, we can start to adjust it and find what it is that's working best for us. Now again, responsiveness is going to come into that, but this is possible, and then you'll do the painful stuff later. And design is going to come to you and they're going to say, circles are good, but you know what we need? It to follow the shape of a cat's head. And don't worry, you'll be like, I've seen this at a talk. And so we can use polygon here as well. We can follow the shape of our furry friend there, and the text will follow along with it. Something that wasn't in click path that is in shape outside is we can use alpha mask. So if you have the mask of whatever the image you can do it much like you would a background image. URL and the path to the image. There's some cause issues here, which is probably not what you're expecting to hear in like a CSS talk. Don't link to the alpha mask on another domain is essentially the short story there, but look into that if you are going to head down this path of specifically the cat mask. All right, so what we've created is a good example of the modern web, but it is Western, right? Everything is kind of Western in what we've been doing. The structures, the styles, the language, it's all kind of, at least for me, what I'm used to in my way of reading. That's not really how the web works, right? That's left, for me, left to right, top to bottom. If we look at somewhere like Japan, they have mangas. Now, I've been a fan of Naruto for a while, so it's fun that I just keep getting to put things that I enjoy into this talk. But this is the same page from the Japanese version and the English version, and even despite it being translated, it still goes from the top right to left, top to bottom. So essentially mirrored to what I'm used to. Now we could position the cells within the grid to do this, right, in that order. But we'll remember the article from earlier. That doesn't make sense in the source order, right? Instead, we can lay the planners. What we want to do is lay the panels out in the way that makes sense for it to be read. So when placed into the grid here, we have 1, 2, 3, with the directions left to right. And this one's we're kind of getting for free with Grid. If we change the direction right to left, Grid has really great internationalization support, and it will flip it to the style that we're needing there. And that's kind of it, right? So we can set it in a way, if someone who, like me, is used to it in English or assistive technology, they have it in the right order. If I'm used to English, I have it in the right order, or right to left, the same thing again. Now, complete sort of sidetrack from that. You may have noticed in Naruto is that the gap is different depending on the horizontal or vertical thing, and you can of course do that in Grid as well. So we have 2 rem and 1 rem for the row and the column. So not related to internationalization, but thought I would point it out in there as well. So what's also worth noting here, if we look at one of the panels side by side, is that the text is running vertically in the Japanese one, but horizontally for English. Now, I'm not going to attempt to write Japanese because I don't know it, but what I've done is put some English text in there and said writing mode, vertical, right to left. When you use English, it sort of turns on its side and goes, but it is vertical. If you use a logographic character set, so aka Japanese style, you will get it stacking correctly like that. I'm not sure why it does that to English, but that's just sort of what it does there. But we can support other languages as well by, making sure that we support both the layout and the reading style that people are accustomed to, right? It gives us a lot of flexibility. So that brings us to kind of the end of our journey through the ages of comics and how they can be brought to the web. Now, I mentioned at the start that although these examples are all for kind of comics, to think about how they could be applied to what it is that you're working on now. I hope the sort of various effects demonstrated throughout the talk have sparked sort of ideas, right? I'd love to see what people take this beyond comics into the everyday work that we're doing now. If you ever kind of look at the Todoist homepage, for example, you will see those grid techniques in how we've laid out one of the videos and it is having comics on the side, maybe a bad example, they're illustrations, but we've used the same techniques there in production, ready to go. Now, we've been in these layout boxes for quite some time. So I imagine when you apply some of these techniques, it's going to be refreshing and give you so many more options than what we've had available before. And that is why I believe we're now in kind of the modern age of layout on the web. CSS Grid has given us these great new powers of flexibility in our layout. We saw how we could stagger content at the start, layer our panels to create more depth and interest. The CSS grid or subgrid, sorry, is like right on the verge of getting there after all this time. Like, I'm excited for that one. We can get a little more creative and break out of these layout boxes with CSS shapes, clip path, and the shape outside, and make our projects as accessible to as wide an audience as possible with grid support for internationalization and making sure that we ourselves make it accessible. Now, I mentioned earlier the CodePen example. This is a collection that has every one of those things there live. I'll just stand here while everyone quickly takes a photo, make up some words. It's my Twitter handle there. Quick. No, you've got plenty of time. In a talk, I can only sort of go into so much detail, and so if reading is more your pace, I've written blog posts in each one of those sections, so you can I've broken it down a little bit more in there. You know, it's about an hour here, but you know, you can get through so much in that, but a little bit more detail there if you want to have a look. Stan Lee, he had this sort of famous catchphrase that he would sign letters off with. It was Excelsior. And I thought it would be a great hat tip to him for everything that he's done, not only in comics, but really any kind of creative medium, right? After looking up its meaning though, I think it's a fantastic way to kind of sign off this talk as well. It stands for ever upward. So take everything that you're kind of learning in this talk and all the other great talks that you're going to see over these few days and take the industry upwards. Thanks very much. So it's a bit speedy flash through this thing. So I have a bit of time. If if you have questions, I'll answer them really slowly. Oh yeah, there's one.
You mentioned browser support for a couple of the things. Is the browser support pretty comprehensive for things like the clip path and the shape outside and the rest of those?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I should actually mention that at the start. Unless I mention the browser support, then you can consider it fairly safe to use in the projects that you're doing now. I've done this talk a few times, and Subgrid's been that one that I've been like desperately. But then when Subgrid does come, I have to remove that joke of like the things fading away. So I'll be sad. I'll have to find something else that browsers don't support. But yes, everything else has got enough support. I mean, support's tricky because it's going to depend on what the project is you're doing. If you're supporting IE, sorry, but also it's going to be a little bit harder for you in that. But if you're kind of on a -2 kind of approach to it, as in the current version -2, then you'll be okay. Any other questions? Yep. I like your shirt.
So I might be showing that I'm not that much of a front-end developer, but can the grid change with user interaction? Is it like, can you fold in and fold out grid columns and such?
Yeah, so there was a while where the grid tracks weren't animatable. You couldn't animate them. But in recent browsers, you have been able to animate the grid tracks. Folding, that's not something I've attempted. I mean, I'm sure someone's given it the old college try, but you can animate them now. So if you wanted to, what I thought would be good is because if we're bringing a static medium like comics to the web, what would be great is if when you hover or interact with them, they get a little bit larger and do some of that. And so now you can animate the tracks. They work like any other CSS animation, which means they're pretty performant and work quite well. And if you've ever done the thing where, you know how you can't animate the height to auto? You can with grid. So if you have a height and someone else was the one that came up with this, but if you animate the grid tracks, you can do height auto animation, which you've never been able to do before. You'd always need some JavaScript library. So that's one that's like a helpful little tidbit there if you do it. Again, like if you look at something like our FAQs on like the pricing page, just to keep shilling my company. If you look at the pricing page on Todoist, that uses that technique with grid to make it so that the accordions will just animate to whatever height that we need them to. So, and that's like a practical use case for it. Cool. Anyone else have a question? No. All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.